It's important to talk about or to reflect upon something that I would like to call the neurosis of the self. Because we're living in a time where we, so to speak, are led to create a neurosis of the self, a neurosis in the self, and the neurosis of the self. Our modern society is practically built, custom made, tailored, bespoke, tailored to create neurosis in the self of the people who live here. Um, you know, the neurosis in the self is something that is produced by society, and it's also, of course, produced by trauma, and by unprocessed trauma, and by faulty education, by false education. I mean, we haven't been completely, truly taught the truth about the self and why the self is actually just an experience. The self is simply just an experience. The self is our own experience of the self. But for us to experience the self as something which does not cause us problems, I mean, for us to experience the self as something neurosis free, we have to live in an environment and in a society that do not create or leads us to create the neurosis of the self. And we also need the right kind of education. We need the right kind of model for understanding what the self really is. And we are trained to believe that the self is content-based. The self is based on content. But I would like to say that the self is more an essential part of us in the way that it is essence and not content. The self is essence and not content. So the self is closer to the soul, heart, essence, experience than the cognitive mind self construction that we usually think of as the psychological self or as the self that we are. Because the self that we are has a certain narrative, and that self is the psychological self. But I would like to say, of course, that I think it is very helpful to see the self as something more essential in the way that it is essence and not content. But anyway, our time creates a neurosis in the self. The neurosis of the self is something that is prevalent in our society, and we suffer from it simply because something is repressed, suppressed, and also unprocessed, not processed. And it is not released, not allowed to be that which it is. We're living in suppression and in oppression and in denial and in self-modification, self-adjusting, self-censorship, so to speak. That leads to the paradigm of a very content-based self. The self is like this. The narrative of the self is like this, which in time also leads to that which can develop into a neurosis of the self if it is also added to by trauma, especially, and other things. It's like the self has to become a product, and the self is that which you can market in the marketplace if you're clever, So the self becomes a product, and over time we become uncomfortable with the self that has become a product, because we are not that product. But that self is a vehicle, The self is a vehicle, as I've said before. The self is a product because it is a vehicle. The self functions as a vehicle because it is meant to represent a product. The thing is that we are led to create a neurosis in the self because we are faced with a model of the self that actually leads to a neurosis of the self. So the self, it's very, and this is the whole point that I want to say here, is that the reason why we talk about the self as something sacred, as something pure, as something of divine essence, something that is the sacred part inside the inner heart. The reason why we talk like this, or the reason why I talk like this, is to counter the neurosis of the self. I know that a lot of people suffer from the neurosis of the self, and I know that many people are stuck in a self-understanding which is fake, which is false, which is not true, and this also, of course, leads to the neurosis of the self, because you know that you're living in a false self, right? So that will, of course, lead to the neurosis of the self. But this is the whole point. Why is spirituality and healing so prevalent now? Why is it so important for us to update ourselves? Why is it so important for us to understand what healing is about? Why do we want to heal the self and the neurosis of the self in this time? Well, simply because the time is ripe. The time has come to heal the neurosis of the self. This is why we have many gurus in this time. This is why we have Muji, Rupert Spira, Eckhart Tolle, and other people who work in order to dissolve the neurosis of the self. And that's what we do. That's what we do as teachers and as representatives of a truer sense of self, as people who teach spiritual or psychological lessons or teachings. We want to reduce the neurosis of the self, And that's why sometimes we become woo-woo. That's why sometimes it becomes a little bit too much of the Shiva shake, sometimes a little bit too much of the inner heart Christ, of the true heart in the inner heart of man, and things like that. It becomes a little bit too woo-woo for people. It becomes too romantic, too puristic. But it is actually because we just simply want to reduce the neurosis of the self, and we want to liberate people and free people from the neurosis of the self, which is, of course, something that is produced in our individual lives because of trauma and repression and models of understanding the self that are not really truly helpful, because they are built on paradigms that are not completely true or not completely helpful for a good experience of that which we call the self. And it is also created by modern day society, which is an avatar society in a way that we are meant to be individuals in an avatar kind of way, So this also creates the neurosis of the self, because we want to produce the product of the self. We need to produce the product of the self, so we need to represent the product of the self that we have created. But this is content-based and it is not essence-based. So the reason why we become people who talk about the inner heart God Christ of the true spiritual man in the inner heart of the Christ heart self, in a way, to make it completely clear and a little bit, you understand the woo-woo kind of thing, is because we want to reduce, we want to take people out of the neurosis of the self. We want to extract the self out of the neurosis of the self. We want to take people out of the neurosis of the self, because we are stuck in a neurosis of the self, and we are led to be stuck there, by the outdated paradigms of psychology and psychiatric diagnosis and psychiatric models. Paradigms that are completely outdated. That's why we need neuroscience and self-science. We need a combination of neuroscience and the science of the self, or an understanding, not the science of the self, but the experience of the self. We need it experientially. We need the experience of the essential self. We need an experience of the self as something that is essence and not content, because we need to reduce the mind activation part within the self and to increase the inner heart part of the self, to get more balance into it, to reduce the neurosis, because the world is practically a neurosis of the self. Just take a look at the world. It's completely neurotic. The Ukraine crisis is a perfect example of the neurosis of the self. The Ukraine crisis is a neurosis of the self, and it is made real because of the neurosis of the self in one singular person. Only one person in this world has made the Ukraine crisis a reality, simply because of a neurosis in the self. That just goes to show how far and how deeply serious this issue is. Just then think about World War II and Hitler and Pol Pot and a lot of people who, if they have a neurosis of the self or not doesn't matter, but they live in some kind of denial, they live in some kind of delusional thinking, and that delusional thinking doesn't come only from projections and interpretation. It also comes from an underlying neurosis in the tissue of the self, so to speak, that creates a certain kind of discomfort that leads to woo-woo thinking, So we just need the right woo-woo thinking and get rid of the wrong woo-woo thinking. To have a good superstition is good. Sometimes we need good illusions. We just need to get rid of the bad delusions. We just need to get rid of that which contributes to the creation and the maintenance of the neurosis of the self, because the neurosis of the self is that which we need to liberate or to reduce or to heal. So this is why we talk about different approaches to that which we experience as the self. This is the reason why we talk about different approaches to the experience of the self. At least it's this for me, because the whole global world society is suffering from a neurosis of the self. That's how I see it. The whole world is afflicted by something that is a neurosis of the self, and which leads to delusion and to mindset and psychosis, certain mindsets and certain psychosis states that are simply just delusional and very damaging and harmful to that which should be true life in a real experience of the essence of that which we can call the self. Thank you. This was just a little rant in a very careful way, in a very modest way, in a very careful way, so that I don't insult anyone. I'm just trying to paint a broader picture. This is why we open the doors to the inner chambers, to the inner hearts of the self, simply because we want to reduce that which is the neurosis of the self, that is to a large part not only responsible for the sickness in this world, but also it is too prevalent, it is too much of a contributor to that which becomes the world. The neurosis of the self should be healed so that we can become more free to create the great world that this could be, if we just liberate the self from the different kinds of neurosis that we acquire during life, and especially in this modern day society.